The frost crawled across the viewport like a living thing, fractal patterns that reminded Kalen of the neural maps they used to study in the war. Everything in this place reminded him of something else, something from before. It was why he'd chosen it. Nostalgia was a form of self-punishment. Oridos, for wasn't meant for permanent habitation. The small moon's thin atmosphere could only be tolerated with aid, and its surface was craggy with mineral deposits that had once made it valuable. Now it was mostly abandoned, a scattered collection of defunct mining stations and the desperate souls who couldn't afford passage elsewhere. Kalen belonged to the latter, though not for financial reasons. Credits weren't his problem. A former military engineer who'd worked on some of the most advanced weaponry systems during the interspecies conflicts, he could have afforded a comfortable life on any number of more hospitable colonies. But comfort wasn't what he sought. He tapped a gloved finger against the viewport, watching the frost recede from the warmth. Station temperature holding at 14 degrees announced the automated system, cold enough to remind him he was alive, warm enough to keep his fingers functioning. The abandoned mining station he claimed had once housed 30 workers. Now it echoed with only his footsteps. The facility's processors still extracted air from the ice deposits below. The recyclers still cleaned water, and the generators still produced power, just enough for one man who required little. Outside, Oridos 4's perpetual twilight cast long shadows across the cratered landscape. The system's distant sun barely crested the horizon here, casting everything in shades of blue and purple. Beautiful, in a desolate way. Beauty without witness. Kalen turned from the window and surveyed his living space. The former operations bay now served as his workshop, sleeping quarters, and kitchen. Tools were arranged with military precision. No personal effects adorned the walls or surfaces. He wasn't here to remember. He pulled on his thermal coat, checking the oxygen indicator on his wrist. A trip to the settlement was overdue. He needed supplies, and the facility's communication system required parts he couldn't fabricate. Activate security protocols, he said to the station's basic AI. Estimated return in 6 hours. The rover he'd modified for the harsh conditions started with a reluctant groan. As he navigated the jagged terrain, he mentally cataloged what he needed: circuit boards, power cells, protein packs. The mundane details of survival. The settlement, if it could be called that, was a hodgepodge of structures clustered around an old hangar bay. Once the central hub for the mining operations, it now served as a marketplace and way station for those passing through to better destinations. People from a dozen different worlds bartered, argued, and simply existed in the shadow of greater civilizations. Kalen parked his rover at the perimeter and secured it. Theft wasn't common here, not because of any moral code, but because everyone knew everyone else's business. He adjusted his breather mask and moved through the airlock. The change in atmosphere was immediate, not just in composition, but in energy. Bodies, voices, smells. Humanity and its various counterparts concentrated in chaotic proximity. He kept his head down, moving with purpose. Interaction wasn't on his shopping list. The parts dealer recognized him, nodding curtly as Kalen approached. "Thought you might have frozen to death out there," the man said, his accent thick with the vowels of the inner planets. "Not yet," Kalen replied, laying out his list. Communication array? Finally calling for rescue. The dealer's laugh turned into a wheezing cough, the result of years on a moon never meant for lungs. Just maintenance. Kalen didn't elaborate. The man didn't really care. It was just the social dance he performed with all customers. While the dealer gathered his items, Kalen's attention drifted across the hangar. Most of the stalls were the usual food, clothing, survival gear. But at the far end, something different was happening. A crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform where a large being with mottled green skin was speaking loudly. "Last auction of the season," the dealer explained, following Kalen's gaze. "Before the pass gets too treacherous. Won't be another for months." Auction. The euphemism tasted sour in Kalen's mind. Slave trade, under a dozen different names, had flourished in the aftermath of the wars. Workforce redistribution, biological asset allocation. Pretty words for an ugly business. The Allied systems banned it officially, but out here on the rim, official meant nothing. Not interested, Kalen said, turning back to his transaction. Course not. Just saying, there's good tech in those units sometimes. Enhancements worth salvaging if you're mechanically inclined. The dealer's eyes gleamed. And I hear, you're very mechanically inclined. Kalen paid for his parts and turned to leave, but something stopped him. A feeling, nothing more, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive during the war when sensors and systems failed. Something in the auctioneer's cadence had changed. Consider this a clearance, the auctioneer was saying as Kalen drifted closer against his better judgment. All units must go before transport. This final specimen was scheduled for recycling, but regulations require a formal offering. On the platform stood a slender figure, head bowed, draped in what appeared to be a simple gray shift. Female formed, though Kalen knew appearances meant little among the bioengineered. What caught his attention was her stillness. Not the frozen fear of the others he'd glimpsed earlier, but something deeper. An absence. Rulith design. Partial integration. Non-communicative. The auctioneer continued, voice dropping with each attribute, as if they were defects reducing value. No vocal response to stimuli. Minimal use capabilities. The crowd was already dispersing. No one bid. The auctioneer sighed, checking a datapad. As recorded, formal offering complete. Unit will be processed for. What's wrong with her? Kalen heard himself ask, surprising even himself. The auctioneer's compound eyes blinked in sequence. The unit? Defective programming. Won't speak. Won't respond properly to commands. Physically intact, but functionally worthless. Kalen stepped closer. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to being discussed. Her skin held a faint luminescence, characteristic of the Rulith species, but dulled, as if viewed through dirty glass. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a crown of crystalline filaments that caught what little light reached them. How much? Again, the words came unbidden. The auctioneer seemed genuinely surprised. For this one? Price of processing, nothing more. 200 credits. Kalen didn't believe in fate or divine intervention. He believed in mechanics, in cause and effect. But he couldn't explain why he reached for his credit chip, why he completed the transaction, or why, 15 minutes later, he was leading the silent figure toward his rover. He didn't speak to her during the drive back to the station. What was there to say? He wasn't even sure she understood language anymore. According to the minimal documentation transferred to his datapad, she'd been found in a ruined Rulith temple during the final campaigns of the war. No identification, no communication, no response to standard protocols. A curiosity kept alive because Rulith biology was still poorly understood and potentially valuable. The silence of his station, once a comfort, now seemed to amplify her presence. He led her inside, the security system acknowledging 2 life forms with a series of beeps. You can, he started, then faltered. What did she do? What did she want? There's a secondary sleeping quarter. Down that corridor. Food in the dispenser. Water. Heat. She stood motionless. Eyes, a deep indigo that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, fixed on some middle distance. Kalen felt a flash of frustration. Can you understand me at all? No response. He sighed, running a hand through his cropped hair. Look, I don't know why I brought you here. I'm not looking for anything. I just couldn't stand the silence of that cage. The irony of bringing her to an even more isolated place wasn't lost on him. But at least here, no one was discussing her processing. I'll show you the quarters, he said finally, gesturing for her to follow. To his mild surprise, she did, her movements fluid despite her apparent detachment. Not defective programming then, he thought. Selective response. Interesting. The secondary sleeping quarters were Spartan, a cot, a small storage unit, a heating element. He'd never used the space. It had been designated for a maintenance assistant he'd never bothered to requisition. It's not much, he said, but it's private. There's a cleansing facility through there. I'll find you some better clothes. She stood in the center of the room, unmoving. Kalen hesitated at the doorway. Do you have a name? The documentation just has a serial designation. When no answer came, he nodded, as if he'd expected nothing different. "All right, I'm Kalen. If you need anything—" He trailed off. How would she ask? "I'll check on you later." He retreated to his workshop, busying himself with the installation of the new parts he'd acquired. Mechanical problems were solvable. They had rules, logic, solutions that could be verified. Nothing like the inexplicable impulse that had led him to bring home a defective being he couldn't communicate with. Hours passed. He finished the repairs, then moved on to other projects, a more efficient heating system, a backup power regulator. Work that could have waited, but kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. Finally, he could avoid it no longer. He prepared a simple meal: protein cubes, synthesized vegetable matter, a portion of the real fruit that was his one luxury, and carried a tray to her quarters. He knocked, not expecting a response, then entered. She sat on the edge of the cot, in exactly the same position he'd last seen her, as if she hadn't moved in hours. Perhaps she hadn't. "Food," he said, placing the tray beside her. "You should eat." She turned her head slightly, the first independent movement he'd seen, and regarded the tray with those absorbing eyes. "It's not poisoned," he added, immediately feeling foolish. If she'd been abused or experimented on, which seemed likely given her condition, such reassurances would mean nothing. To his surprise, she reached for a piece of fruit, hesitantly, as if the action required immense concentration. She held it, studying its contours, before bringing it to her lips. Kalen realized he was staring and turned away, giving her privacy. "I'll leave you to it," he said, moving toward the door. "If you want more, the food dispenser is programmed to respond to presence. Just stand in front of it." That night, lying in his cot, Kalen wondered what madness had possessed him. He was no caretaker, no healer. He'd come to Oridos for to disappear, not to rescue strays, especially not one so clearly damaged. He thought of his team, the faces he'd left behind in the escape pod, their expressions as they realized he wasn't coming with them. Surprise, confusion, betrayal. The explosion that followed, consuming the research facility and everyone left inside. That had been his rescue mission. A spectacular failure. Morning on Oridos, for was a relative term. The chronometer indicated dawn, though the perpetual twilight showed little change. Kalen rose, performed his ablutions, and checked the station systems, routine first, always. He found her in the command center, standing before the largest viewport, watching the slow dance of ice crystals in the wind. She wore the same gray shift, her luminescence slightly brighter in the dim light. "Good morning," he said, unsure of protocol. Was it ridiculous to maintain social niceties with someone who didn't respond? She turned, acknowledging his presence with a slight inclination of her head. Progress of a sort. "I've been thinking," he continued, moving to the food dispenser to prepare his morning ration. "You need a name. I can't keep thinking of you as her or the Rilith." He paused. "Unless you already have a name you could share?" The silence was expected, but still heavy. "In that case, I'm going to call you Syrah," he decided. It was my grandmother's name. She didn't talk much either. A weak joke, but it helped normalize the one-sided conversation. He gestured to the food dispenser. "Are you hungry?" Syrah, and already the name seemed to fit her, moved toward him with that same fluid grace. She stood before the dispenser, and as promised, it hummed to life, presenting a standard breakfast ration. She took it, her movements more assured than the previous evening. "I need to run some tests on the perimeter sensors today," Kalen said as they ate in silence. "The cold affects the calibration." "You can. Well, you could do whatever you want, I suppose. The station is secure. The only danger is boredom." After breakfast, he donned his thermal gear and headed out. The work was straightforward but time-consuming, requiring him to check each sensor node around the station's extensive perimeter. The physical activity felt good, purposeful, clear. When he returned hours later, the station seemed different somehow. It took him a moment to identify what had changed. The lighting in the command center had been adjusted, softened, and there was something on the central console, a small arrangement of objects, a piece of mineral crystal, a spare power cell, and a curved piece of metal, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Sira stood nearby, watching him. "Did you do this?" he asked, approaching the arrangement. She didn't answer, but her eyes followed his movements with new intensity. Kalen studied the objects. They formed a kind of rough spiral with a crystal at the center. "It's interesting," he said, genuinely curious. "Is it significant? In your culture, perhaps?" Again, no response, but she moved closer, reaching out to touch the crystal, rotating it slightly. "An adjustment," Kalen observed. "It matters how they're arranged. Is it art or something else?" The questions hung unanswered, but something had changed. Communication was happening, even without words. Sira was expressing something, and Kalen found himself wanting to understand. In the days that followed, a routine developed. Kalen continued his maintenance work around the station, while Sira created more arrangements, some small and intricate, others sprawling across entire surfaces. She began using items he hadn't provided, pieces of ice she must have collected from. Outside, sections of discarded circuitry, fabric unraveled from her own garment. He gave her better clothes, thermal layers, proper boots, a coat for the rare occasions when she showed interest in accompanying him outside. She accepted these offerings with the same quiet intensity she showed her creations, sometimes incorporating parts of them into new arrangements. Kalen found himself talking more, filling the silence with observations, explanations of his work, even stories from before. Not the war, never that, but his childhood on Vega Prime, his education, the early days of his career when engineering had been about creation rather than destruction. "My father wanted me to be a doctor," he told her one evening as they sat in the command center, watching a rare atmospheric phenomenon that painted the sky in ribbons of amber and violet. He said engineers only cared about machines, not people. Ironic, considering how it all turned out. Sira turned to look at him, then, her gaze direct in a way it rarely was. For a moment, Kalen thought she might speak, but she only reached out, her luminescent fingers hovering near his face without touching, as if mapping his features from a distance. "It's all right," he said, though what he was reassuring her about, he couldn't have said. "We're all right here." That night, he dreamed of the research facility for the first time in months. The alarms, the fire, Commander Eldon shouting for evacuation. The weight of his decision as he realized what their work had created, what would be used for if it left the facility. His hands on the destruct sequence, the final responsibility he'd accepted while ordering everyone else to the escape pods. He woke, gasping, the phantom heat of the explosion on his skin. The station's cool air gradually brought him back to the present, to Oridos 4 and its perpetual twilight. A sound drew his attention, soft, almost imperceptible. He rose, following it to the command center. Sira knelt before a new arrangement, larger than any previous creation. It sprawled across the floor, a complex pattern of objects that somehow suggested a cityscape scene from above. And she was humming, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to make the objects vibrate in sympathy. Kalen stood transfixed. The sound wasn't quite music, wasn't quite language, but contained elements of both. It resonated in his chest, raising the hair on his arms. "Sira," he said softly. The humming stopped abruptly. She looked up, and for the first time, he saw fear in those absorbing eyes. "No, don't stop," he said quickly. "It's beautiful. I didn't know you could make sounds." She remained frozen, poised as if for flight. Kalen took a careful step closer, then another, until he could kneel at the edge of her creation. "What is it?" he asked. "What are you building?" Her gaze dropped to the pattern, and one luminescent hand gestured in a sweeping motion across it. "A map," he guessed. "A place." Her fingers traced a specific section, a dense cluster of objects at the center. "A city? Your home." The humming resumed, so quietly he had to strain to hear it. The objects in the cluster vibrated slightly, as if responding. Resonance, Kalen breathed, engineer's mind immediately grasping the principle. You're creating resonant frequencies. The objects respond to your voice. Sira's eyes met his, and there was something new there, a spark of connection, of being understood. That moment marked a turning point. Though Sira still didn't speak, communication blossomed between them. Her humming became more frequent, more varied. Kalen learned to recognize certain patterns: approval, curiosity, warning. He began to understand that her arrangements were not random art, but complex symbolic systems, representing places, events, emotions. He brought her materials from his excursions: interesting stones, pieces of equipment, anything that might resonate with her strange harmonics. She accepted these offerings with increasing animation, incorporating them into ever more elaborate constructions. One day, reviewing the station's perimeter logs, Kalen noticed an anomaly. A brief power fluctuation in the eastern sensor grid, too precise to be weather-related. He frowned, rewinding the data. There, a momentary bypass sequence, the kind used by professional infiltration teams. Someone had been testing their defenses. His first instinct was to dismiss it as routine scavengers. Abandoned stations were prime targets for salvage. But something felt wrong. The technique was too clean, too professional. He checked the date. 3 days ago. No further attempts had been recorded, which meant either they'd given up, unlikely given the sophistication of the probe, or they were planning a more comprehensive approach. Kalen found Sira in what had become her room, though she rarely slept there. The space had been transformed by her arrangements. The walls and ceiling now covered in patterns that seemed to shift in the light. She was working on a new construction, humming softly. "Sira," he said, and something in his tone must have communicated urgency, because she looked up immediately. "We may have visitors soon. Unwelcome ones." She tilted her head, questioning. "I don't know who," he answered the unspoken query. "But they've been testing our security." He hesitated. "It might be about you." Her humming stopped. The fear returned to her eyes, but now accompanied by something harder, resolve, perhaps. "I won't let them take you," Kalen said, surprising himself with the vehemence of the declaration. "This is your home now, if you want it to be." Sira rose in a fluid motion and moved to the largest of her wall arrangements. She adjusted several pieces, and the entire pattern seemed to shift, taking on a new configuration that somehow conveyed defensiveness, protection. "Yes," Kalen agreed, understanding her meaning, if not her method. "We'll prepare." The next 2 days were spent reinforcing the station's security systems. Kalen installed redundant locks, rerouted critical systems through backup channels, and prepared emergency protocols. Sira worked alongside him, her arrangements now appearing as strategic points throughout the station. He wasn't sure what purpose they served, but he'd learned to trust her instincts. The attack, when it came, was not the frontal assault Kalen had expected. It began with a communication, the first external transmission the station had received in months. "Mining Station H-17, this is Allied Systems Enforcement," crackled a voice through the speakers. "We are conducting a routine inspection. Please prepare for boarding." Kalen exchanged a glance with Sira, who had gone very still beside him. "Allied Systems doesn't have jurisdiction here," he said, not activating the return channel. "And they don't conduct routine inspections on the rim." The voice continued, unaware it wasn't being received. "We have reason to believe you are harboring stolen property. Cooperation will result in minimal penalties." "Stolen property," Kalen repeated softly. "That's what they're calling you." He activated the external cameras. A small craft had docked at the emergency airlock, sleek, unmarked, definitely not Allied Systems. "Slavers," he concluded, looking to reclaim valuable merchandise. He turned to Sira. "The one who sold you to me, did he seem like the type to sell something valuable for almost nothing?" She shook her head, a gesture she'd adopted from him. "I didn't think so, which means they've learned something about you since then. Something that makes you worth coming after." He studied her face. "What can you do, Sira? What makes you valuable to them?" For a moment, she was perfectly still. Then she raised her hands, palms up, and began to hum. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard from her before, deeper, more resonant, with harmonics that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and vibrate directly in his bones. The objects in the nearest arrangement began to move, rising gently from their positions and orbiting her hands. Not just vibrating now, but levitating, controlled by nothing but sound. Acoustic manipulation, Kalen whispered, awestruck. You're creating standing waves, controlling the pressure differentials. The engineer in him immediately grasped the applications and the military potential. That's why they want you back. You're a weapon. The humming ceased abruptly, and the objects clattered back to their positions. Sierra's expression was stricken. No, Kalen corrected himself. Not a weapon. A person with an ability they want to weaponize. He took her hands, stilling their trembling. I said I wouldn't let them take you, and I meant it. But I need to know what we're dealing with. How strong is this ability? Can you affect larger objects? Living tissue. She pulled away, her luminescence dimming in what he'd come to recognize as distress. I'm not asking you to use it against them, Kalen clarified. I just need to understand the situation fully. A pounding at the main airlock interrupted them. Final warning, came the voice, now from outside the station. Open up, or we'll breach. Kalen moved to the security console, activating the external speakers. This is a private research facility. You have no authority here. Leave immediately. A laugh crackled through the system. Kalen Voss, former military engineer, wanted for sabotage and treason. You're in no position to quote authority. The name hit him like a physical blow. They knew who he was, which meant they weren't just random slavers. They had connections, resources. We just want to relive, the voice continued. Give her to us, and we'll leave you to your retirement. Resist, and we'll take her anyway, along with you for the bounty. Sierra moved to Kalen's side, her eyes questioning. They know about my past, he explained quietly. About what I did during the war. He'd never told her the full story, had barely acknowledged it to himself. I destroyed a weapons research facility. My own project. When I realized what they planned to use it for, indiscriminate planetary bombardment, civilian targets. I couldn't let it happen. The admission hung between them. Kalen expected judgment, or at least surprise, but Sierra's expression showed only understanding. She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity he'd never experienced from her before. They're lying about letting me go, he added. Once they have you, they'll take me too. Less witnesses that way. The pounding at the airlock grew more insistent. Metal groaned as cutting tools began to work on the outer seal. We need to move, Kalen decided. There's a maintenance shaft that leads to an emergency exit on the far side. We can take the rover, try to reach the settlement. They hurried through the corridors, gathering only essential supplies. As they passed through Sierra's room, she paused, reaching for something among her arrangements. There's no time, Kalen urged, but she insisted, retrieving a small crystal similar to the one she'd used in her first creation. They had just reached the maintenance shaft when the station rocked with an explosion. The airlock had been breached. Hurry, Kalen whispered, helping Sierra into the narrow passage. They crawled through darkness, guided only by the faint glow of emergency lighting strips. Behind them, voices echoed through the station's corridors. At least 3 intruders, possibly more. The emergency exit was designed as a last resort in case of catastrophic pressure loss or fire. A simple hatch leading directly outside, with a small alcove containing emergency environmental suits. Put this on, Kalen instructed, helping Sierra into one of the suits. It's not built for extended use, but it will protect you until we reach the rover. As he secured his own suit, a crash sounded from within the station. They'd found the maintenance shaft entrance. They're close, Kalen warned. Once we're outside, stay low and move fast. The rover is 50 meters east. He pressed the emergency release, and the hatch slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The perpetual twilight of Oridos 4 greeted them, the horizon a smear of distant stars above jagged terrain. They had taken only a few steps when light bloomed behind them, headlamps from their pursuers already emerging from the hatch. Run, Kalen urged, pulling Sierra toward the barely visible shape of the rover. A shot cracked past them, missing by centimeters. Energy weapons. They wanted Sierra alive, but Kalen was expendable. They reached the rover, Kalen fumbling with the access code, painfully aware of the approaching footsteps. The door slid open, and he shoved Syrah inside, diving in after her as another shot sizzled through the space where he'd been standing. The rover's engine roared to life, but as Kalen engaged the drive, a figure appeared directly in front of them, a tall, armored individual holding what appeared to be a disruptor cannon. "Stop the vehicle," the figure commanded through an external speaker. "Last chance." Kalen's hands tightened on the controls. The rover could probably withstand a disruptor hit, but not at such close range. They were trapped. Beside him, Syrah made a decision. She unlatched her helmet, a dangerous move in the thin atmosphere, and held the crystal she'd retrieved to her throat. Then she began to hum. The sound was like nothing Kalen had ever heard, pure, resonant, building in power until it seemed to fill the entire rover, the entire world. The crystal at her throat glowed, amplifying the frequencies. Outside, the armored figure staggered, the disruptor cannon drooping in suddenly nerveless hands. The ground itself began to vibrate, fine particles of ice and mineral dust rising in concentric patterns around the rover. Syrah's humming grew louder, more complex. The patterns expanded, the vibrations intensified. Fissures appeared in the ice beneath the armored figure's feet. "Syrah," Kalen murmured, torn between awe and concern. Her face was strained, the effort clearly immense. The humming reached a crescendo. The ice cracked with a sound like thunder, a warning fissure opening between the rover and their pursuers. Not deep enough to be truly dangerous, but a clear demonstration of power. Syrah collapsed back in her seat, replacing her helmet with shaking hands. Her luminescence had dimmed to almost nothing, her crystalline filaments dull. Kalen didn't waste the opportunity. He gunned the rover's engine, swerving around the stunned attackers and accelerating across the broken terrain. In the rearview display, he saw them scrambling back toward their vessel, but making no immediate move to pursue. "That was incredible," he said when they put several kilometers between themselves and the station. "And terrifying. Are you all right?" Syrah nodded weakly, her form curled protectively around the crystal, which still glowed. "Faintly. That's why they want you," Kalen realized. "Not just acoustic manipulation, geological disruption. You can create controlled earthquakes, avalanches. The perfect weapon for establishing mining claims or destroying enemy infrastructure." She flinched at the word weapon, and Kalen immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's not what you are. It's just what they want to use you for." He glanced at the crystal. "Is that some kind of amplifier? Part of your cultural technology?" Syrah held it up, allowing him to see it more clearly. Within the crystalline structure, faint patterns swirled, similar to the arrangements she created but organic, flowing. "It's beautiful," Kalen said. "Like your songs." She placed it carefully in a storage compartment, then leaned back, clearly exhausted. "Rest," he advised. "We have a long drive. The settlement isn't safe. They'll look for us there. We need to find somewhere to regroup, figure out our next steps." As Syrah drifted into a fitful sleep, Kalen pondered their options. The station was compromised, the settlement too exposed. They couldn't go off-world without documentation. Documentation that would immediately alert authorities to his identity. And with winter approaching, survival in the wilderness of Oridos would be challenging at best. The solution, when it came to him, was so obvious he almost laughed. The abandoned mines. The extensive network of tunnels beneath the surface, carved by decades of industrial extraction before the corporations moved on to richer deposits elsewhere. Some still had functioning life support systems, powered by geothermal taps that required no maintenance. "Perfect for someone who can manipulate stone," he murmured, glancing at Syrah's sleeping form. He adjusted course, heading for the nearest mine entrance he knew of, a secondary shaft that had served as an emergency exit for one of the larger operations. It was several hours' drive through increasingly rugged terrain, but the rover was designed for these conditions. Syrah woke as they approached the entrance, a dark gash in the side of a towering ice formation. She studied it with evident apprehension. "It's a mine," Kalen explained. "Abandoned, but the inner chambers should still be habitable and defensible." She nodded slowly, but her posture remained tense as they drove into the darkness. The tunnel sloped gently downward, wide enough for the rover, but only barely. Emergency lighting strips, powered by the same geothermal system that maintained life support, flickered to life as they passed, triggered by motion sensors that had lain dormant for years. They emerged into a vast chamber, the main staging area for what had once been a bustling operation. Machinery stood silent, preserved by the cold and dry air. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive pillars of native stone left in place during excavation. "We should be safe here, at least for now," Kalen said, bringing the rover to a stop. "The life support system seems functional. Temperatures livable. No one's been here in years." They exited the vehicle, Syrah immediately moving to touch one of the stone pillars. She closed her eyes, running her luminescent fingers over the rough surface. "What is it?" Kalen asked. "Can you feel something?" She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw a smile, small, tentative, but unmistakable. She gestured around the chamber, then placed her palm flat against the pillar and hummed a short, questioning note. "This place, it speaks to you somehow." Kalen guessed. "The stone responds to your resonance?" Her smile widened fractionally. She nodded. "Then we chose well," he said, relieved. "Let's set up a base. There should be stores here, emergency rations, equipment. Mining operations always keep contingencies." They spent the next hours exploring the immediate area of the mine, establishing a secure perimeter and inventorying their resources. As Kalen had predicted, there were substantial emergency supplies, enough food for months, medical equipment, even spare environmental suits. What he hadn't expected was Syrah's growing animation. In this place of stone and silence, she seemed more alive, more present than he'd ever seen her. She moved from pillar to pillar, chamber to chamber, humming different notes and listening to the responses with evident delight. This was a good choice, Kalen observed as they settled in a smaller chamber they'd adapted as living quarters. "You're connected to this place." Syrah nodded, then did something unprecedented. She took his hand and placed it against the wall, covering it with her own. She hummed, and Kalen felt the stone vibrate beneath his palm, not violently as before, but gently, a living response. "I feel it," he said, amazed. "It's like a conversation." She nodded again, her luminescence brightening with pleasure at being understood. That night, they slept more peacefully than either had in days. The pursuers might still be searching, but the mine was a sanctuary, not just from external threats, but from the isolation that had defined their existence on Oridos 4. Kalen woke to find Syrah already at work, creating a new arrangement in the center of their living space. This one was different from her previous constructions, more deliberate, more structured. She had gathered stones of various sizes and compositions, arranging them in concentric circles with the crystal at the center. "What are you building?" he asked, watching her methodical movements. She looked up, considering how to communicate her intention. Finally, she pointed to the crystal, then to herself, then made a series of expanding gestures. "An amplifier?" Kalen guessed. "For your abilities?" She nodded, then pointed to him, to herself, and to the stone arrangement. "For both of us? A way to communicate better." Another nod, more emphatic. "I'd like that," Kalen said, moved by the effort she was making. "What can I do to help?" She guided him in gathering more materials. Specific types of stone from different parts of the mine, fragments of metal from abandoned equipment, even water collected from a seep in one of the deeper chambers. Each element was placed with precision in the growing arrangement. As they worked, Kalen found himself talking more than usual, sharing thoughts he'd never voiced aloud. "I never told you why I really came to Oridos 4, he said as they positioned a particularly dense piece of ore. "It wasn't just to disappear after the sabotage. It was because I failed." Syrah paused, listening. "I set the charges, started the destruct sequence, ordered everyone to the escape pods. But I was too late. They'd already transmitted the weapon specifications to Central Command. Destroying the facility didn't stop anything. It just killed the people who were still there. The weapon was built anyway, used anyway. He struggled with the weight of the confession. I became a murderer for nothing. Sira shook her head, her expression fierce. She pointed to him, then to her heart. You think I did the right thing, even though it failed? Kaelin translated. She nodded, then mimed an explosion, followed by a questioning gesture. What was the weapon? Kaelin sighed. We called it the harmonic destabilizer. It used acoustic principles to disrupt molecular bonds in targeted materials. Could liquefy metal, shatter stone, turn atmosphere itself into a weapon. They said it would be surgical precise. But the field tests showed the resonance cascade was unpredictable, exponential. Cities would be affected, not just military targets. He looked at her with sudden realization. Not unlike what you can do, but industrialized, weaponized. Sira's eyes widened. She touched the crystal at the center of the arrangement. Then her throat, her expression troubled. Yes, Kaelin confirmed. I think they were trying to replicate abilities like yours. Maybe even based on captured Relith subjects. The thought sickened him. Is that why you were in that temple? Were you hiding? She shook her head, then mimed what appeared to be a recording or listening action. You were documenting something? Listening to something? She pointed her head, then made a sweeping gesture encompassing everything around them. Memory, Kaelin guessed. You were some kind of memory keeper? For your people? She nodded vigorously, pleased with his understanding. And they captured you. Tried to use your abilities. It wasn't a question. The pieces were falling into place. That's why you wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond. It wasn't damage or defect. It was resistance. You were protecting your knowledge. Sira's luminescence flared briefly in confirmation. Understand, Kaelin said softly. More than I can say. They continued working on the arrangement through the day and into the night, stopping only for brief meals and rest. By the time they finished, it filled most of the chamber floor, a complex mandala of stone, metal, and crystal, with channels of water flowing in prescribed patterns. Now what? Kaelin asked, surveying their creation. Sira gestured for him to sit across from her, the arrangement between them. She placed her hands on two specific stones at the perimeter, indicating he should do the same. When he complied, she began to hum, softly at first, then with growing intensity. The crystal at the center began to glow, and the entire arrangement vibrated in harmony. The sensation traveled up Kaelin's arms, resonating in his chest, his skull. Images formed in his mind, not his own memories, but glimpses of another life. A towering structure of living crystal, chambers filled with light. Figures moving in ritualized patterns, their humming creating structures in the air itself. A young female, her luminescence vibrant, being chosen for a sacred role. Memory keeper, voice of the ancestors. Then darkness. Explosions. Soldiers. Pain. Kaelin gasped, pulling his hands away. The connection broke abruptly. That was... You show me your memories. Your past. Sira nodded, her expression both sad and hopeful. The temple. The invasion. Your training as a... What did you call it? A memory keeper? He struggled to process what he'd experienced. This is incredible, Sira. True telepathic communication through resonance. She gestured for him to try again, replacing his hands on the stones. This time, Kaelin attempted to project his own thoughts, focusing on his memories of coming to Oridos for finding the abandoned station, the isolation that had both punished and protected him. The moment he'd seen her on the auction platform, the inexplicable compulsion to bring her home. When they separated again, Sira's eyes were shimmering with emotion. She reached across the arrangement, touching his face gently. You understood, Kaelin said, his voice rough. You felt what I felt. She nodded, then pointed to both of them and mimed building something. We can create something together now, he interpreted. Something new. The days that followed brought a transformation of their underground sanctuary. With Sira's guidance, they began shaping the stone itself, not destructively as during their escape, but creatively, coaxing the natural material into new forms that enhanced the ambient resonance. The central chamber became a true living space, with areas delineated by carefully positioned stone formations. Smaller chambers branched off for privacy or specific purposes. Water was channeled through the space in musical rivulets. Light was amplified and directed by crystalline formations Sira encouraged to grow from the ceiling and walls. They communicated more freely now, though still without conventional language. The resonance arrangement allowed them to share not just thoughts but emotions, sensations, memories. Kaylin learned of Sira's childhood among the crystal spires of her home world, her training in the ancient discipline of memory keeping, the invasion that had destroyed her temple and scattered her people. In turn, he shared more of himself than he ever had with another being. His ambitions as a young engineer, his gradual disillusionment as his talents were turned toward weapons development, the terrible choice that had led him to Oridos 4. One evening, as they sat beside a pool of collected water that reflected the crystalline formations above, Sira initiated a deeper connection. Through the resonance, she showed him not just memories but possibilities, visions of what their sanctuary could become with time and care. A true home, not just a hiding place. A fusion of their disparate abilities and knowledge. "It's beautiful," Kaylin said when the vision faded. "I never thought of staying here permanently, but why not? It's defensible, self-sufficient with the geothermal energy. And no one would look for us in an abandoned mine." Sira's expression was questioning. She pointed to him, then outward, her meaning clear. Would he want to stay, or did he still yearn for escape? "Before you, I was just waiting," Kaylin admitted. "Not living, just existing. Penance for my failures. But now," he struggled to articulate the change. "Now, there's purpose again. Connection." She smiled, her luminescence bright in the dim chamber. "But what about you?" he asked. "Don't you want to find your people? Return to your role as memory keeper." Sira's response came through resonance rather than gesture, a complex emotional tapestry of loss, acceptance, and discovery. Her temple was gone, most of her people scattered or dead. Her duties remained, but they could be fulfilled here as well as anywhere. And here, there was something new, something unexpected. "I understand," Kaylin said, and he did. They were both refugees, in a sense, both carrying responsibilities from their past lives, both finding unexpected redemption in this unlikely place. The decision to make the mine their permanent home brought new energy to their work. They expanded their living space, improved the life support systems using Kaylin's engineering skills, and created more sophisticated resonance arrangements to enhance Sira's abilities. She began recording again, not just her own memories, but the story of their meeting, their escape, their creation of this new home. These she stored in crystals similar to the one she'd carried from the station, a continuation of her sacred duty as memory keeper. Kaylin, for his part, found himself designing again. Not weapons, but tools and structures that worked in harmony with Sira's resonance abilities. Together, they created a hybrid technology neither of their species had developed alone. Weeks passed. Winter deepened on the surface, but in their underground sanctuary, they were warm and safe. Occasionally, Kaylin made carefully planned expeditions to the settlement for supplies they couldn't produce themselves, but these became less frequent as they developed greater self-sufficiency. There was no further sign of their pursuers. Perhaps they concluded the chase wasn't worth the effort. Perhaps they'd found other prey. Kaylin remained vigilant, maintaining security systems and escape plans, but the constant fear gradually receded. One day, as they worked on a new expansion of their living space, Sira suddenly stopped. She tilted her head, listening to something Kaylin couldn't perceive. "What is it?" he asked, alert for any sign of danger. She shook her head, indicating it wasn't a threat. Instead, she led him to a section of wall they hadn't yet modified, placing her hand against the stone and humming a questioning note. The rock responded with a resonance different from any they'd encountered before, deeper, more complex. Sira's expression was one of wonder. Through their resonance arrangement, she conveyed what she'd discovered, an ancient chamber, sealed for millennia, containing crystal formations of extraordinary purity and power. not a natural formation, but something created by her people long before human colonization of this system. A Rilith site? Here. Kalen was amazed, but the historical records never mentioned. Syrah's response was knowing, almost amused. Her people had been travelers among the stars long before humans developed spaceflight. They'd left outposts on many worlds, most hidden, forgotten even by their own kind as civilizations rose and fell. Over the next days, they carefully excavated an opening to the chamber, following Syrah's guidance to avoid disturbing the delicate energy patterns within. When they finally broke through, the sight took Kalen's breath away. The chamber was vast, domed, its walls lined with crystal formations that caught and amplified the light from their lamps. At the center stood a structure like a tree made of light, branches of energy flowing from a central trunk, constantly shifting in patterns Kalen couldn't begin to comprehend. "It's magnificent," he whispered. Syrah moved forward reverently, approaching the central structure. She knelt before it, humming a sequence that seemed both greeting and inquiry. The energy tree responded, its patterns shifting to mirror her tones. Through their resonance, Kalen understood. This was a memory vault, a repository of knowledge created by ancient Rilith memory keepers. It contained histories, sciences, philosophies, the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had nearly been lost. Syrah turned to him, her expression transforming. She pointed to the vault, then to herself, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed their entire sanctuary. "This is why we're here," Kalen realized. "Not chance or coincidence. Your abilities led you to this place, even if you didn't know it." He approached, standing beside her before the luminous structure. "Your duty as memory keeper can continue." Her next communication was both shocking and deeply moving. Through the resonance, she conveyed her intention to make him a part of the memory vault, to record his knowledge, his experiences, his unique human perspective alongside the ancient Rilith wisdom. "Me?" Kalen was stunned. "But I'm not. I've done terrible things, made terrible mistakes." Syrah's response was gentle but firm. That was precisely why his memories were valuable. The vault contained the full spectrum of experience, triumphs and failures, wisdom and folly. All were part of the tapestry. "If you're sure," he said finally, "I'd be honored." The process took days. Syrah guided him through specific resonance patterns, teaching him to focus his memories and knowledge in ways that could be captured by the vault. It was exhausting, sometimes painful, but also cathartic, a true reckoning with his past. When it was complete, something had changed between them. The connection that had begun with a reluctant purchase, grown through silence and gesture, and deepened through resonance, had become something Kalen had no name for. Not quite family, not quite friendship, not quite love as humans understood it, but containing elements of all three. One morning, after a session with the memory vault, they sat together by the reflecting pool they'd created in their living space. Sunlight, channeled from the surface through a complex system of mirrors and crystals, danced across the water. "We should mark this place," Kalen said suddenly. "Create something that signifies what we've built here. Not just for ourselves, but for anyone who might find it in the future." Syrah considered, then nodded. She led him to a smooth section of wall they'd left unworked, and through resonance, shared her vision. A sculpture emerging from the stone itself, two figures intertwined, separated by a fissure, but reaching across it. "Perfect," Kalen agreed. "Flawed but connected. Like us." They worked together, Syrah using her resonance to loosen the stone, Kalen applying his engineer's precision to shape it. Day by day, the sculpture took form, abstract enough to be universal, specific enough to tell their story. When it was complete, Syrah did something unprecedented. She stepped close to Kalen, placed her hands on either side of his face, and spoke for the first time since he'd known her. "If I sleep," she asked, her voice rough from disuse but musical, resonant with harmonics he felt as much as heard. "Will you be here when I wake?" Kalen's heart clenched with unexpected emotion. "I'm here," he promised. "Now and always." Together, they carved their names into the base of the sculpture. not to claim ownership, but to affirm presence. Kalen Voss, Sira of the Crystal Temple. Not slave, not owner, not weapon, not failure. Just two beings who had found, in the most unlikely of places, something worth preserving in the memory of stone. The light shifted, catching the fissure that separated the two figures in their sculpture. But rather than a division, it now seemed like a connection, a space where two different substances met and transformed each other, creating something stronger than either alone. Outside, winter raged across the surface of Oridos 4. But beneath, in chambers warmed by geothermal energy and illuminated by channeled light, a new kind of sanctuary continued to grow. Stone shaped by sound, space defined by presence, memory preserved in crystal. And in the heart of it all, two beings who had once been defined by what they'd lost now defined themselves by what they'd found.